Recording. Well, hello, everybody. Everybody should wave. It's a little bit of exercise in the afternoon. This is a good thing. And I don't know if you came armed with non-alcoholic beverages, but if you did, please feel free to take a sip. Thank you all for joining us and for joining this great conversation and for being here to hear Professor Peter Loge's very significant thoughts on whether we can get ethics into our political communication, and if so, how. He's written a book, or he's helped author a book with participation and chapters submitted by many other great thinkers and doers. And so we're here to discuss tonight political communication ethics, theory and practice, and as I like to say, either desperate oxymoron or desperate need. I prefer to think of desperate need. So I'm Frank Sesno. I've met many of you, and that's really great. A few of you have been students, in fact, and many colleagues. Some of you may know me from my 11 years as director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University, or you may have the unfortunate chance of knowing me from my years at CNN, where I was a White House correspondent, I was an anchor and a Sunday talk show host, and I was the Washington bureau chief. So I've experienced, shall we say, the lack of ethics in political communication up close and personal, and I'm fascinated by what Peter and the others have done to put this all together, and I'm really looking forward to a great conversation with Peter and with you and where we go. A couple of logistical requests, and probably most of you are very well used to this now because we now live in the Zoom world. Could I ask everybody, if you haven't done so already, to mute your microphones so that if there's phones ringing, dogs howling, or music blaring in the background, you don't share that till you're ready. I'm going to introduce our guests. I'm going to ask Peter to say a few words about his book. And then we're also going to draw your questions in. So as we go, or even before we start going, if you have a question, do you all have the chat function at the bottom of your screens? I see some no's and some yeses. Well, if you do, that's where you can put a question in. Zoe's saying no, she doesn't have the chat function. I don't know what to tell you, Zoe. Or anybody else who doesn't have the chat function, feel free to text me a question. You can do that. I'll give you my phone number. You can write it all down now. Well, maybe I don't want to do that, Peter, since this is being recorded for posterity. But if you don't have a question, figure it out. Send it to us as an email or something like that. But we will gather your questions and incorporate those in. As Peter mentioned, this event is being recorded. A recording will be posted on the Projects on Ethics and Political Communication website in the next few days. Take some smaller clips. We'll try to share those, put those out through social media. And I encourage you to do that as well. Use your social media to capture some of the great ideas and thoughts, never mind the book. So let's go then. First of all, I'd like to start by introducing Peter Loge. He actually needs no introduction, certainly for this group, but for all who know him, because he's amazing. He's an associate professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs. He's the director of this project on ethics and political communication, which is something that he came up with. He originated and conceived of this idea, and I'm delighted to see that it's taken shape in the way it has. He spent more than 25 years working in strategic and political communication, service in senior staff roles up on the Hill in Congress in the Obama administration. And he joined the faculty of the School of Media and Public Affairs, our faculty, full-time in the fall of 2017. In the next spring, he started teaching a course on ethics and political communication. So Peter, I'll just, before I make my next introduction, say thank you and welcome.
Thank you so very much. It's great to be here. You're going to introduce Anthony, or do we?
I am. I was.
Okay. Thank you for the very kind, overly generous introduction.
Well,
it's confusing when people say that many nice things about me in a row. So I was
yeah, right. I think it's always a good thing for that to be done before we're eulogized. I think we should not waste opportunities. Anthony Thomas is also with us. Anthony, why don't you say hi to everybody so people can see you and say hi?
Hello.
Anthony is a rising junior at the School of Media and Public Affairs. He was a student of Peter's ethics class last spring. He's very passionate, Anthony is, about politics. He participates at the local level in a variety of things, and he aspires to do communications for progressive candidates. I should tell you that there's a lot more to Anthony than his scholastic profile would indicate. He, in his free time, he acts in theater productions. He writes for a GW-based satirical television show and We certainly need more satire in the world. And as a native Washingtonian, he's involved in the local politics of the city and working for DC City Council candidate Janice Lewis George. Peter, let's start with you. You've got this book. You've assembled a number of authors, thinkers, doers, theoreticians, practitioners. Take a few minutes and tell us tell us why everybody here needs to buy many copies of your book.
Well, it's mostly written as a textbook, so some of you are going to have to buy it at some point. After we clean up the recording a little bit, I'm going to send around a link tomorrow to the recording, and everyone's also going to get a description of the book that includes a flyer with a big discount. So if you're an SMPA undergraduate, I'm just saying, at some point you're going to have to buy it. Otherwise, I think if you're interested in politics, you might find it interesting. I'm going to take a bit of self-indulgence, if I might, Frank, and to thank everybody who's on this Zoom, who joined us by the grammar of COVID is very confusing here on what I believe is March 159th. I'm just sort of time and space get a little bit squishy. I want to tell you why the book exists and as a way of setting up the project and today's conversation. I was an adjunct at GW for many, many years, as some of you know, and I would always talk about ethics because it seems like an important thing to do, and we've given this tremendous responsibility to participate in politics. But then I was interviewing for the job to join full time, and as many of you know, if you interview for a job as an academic, you sit down one-on-one with other faculty and they ask you questions and they grill you a little bit. And I was sitting down for lunch with Steve Roberts, well-respected, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and he said, when you go to your big presentation, you're going to be asked what you want to teach. And the answer can't be, I don't know, whatever you need, because you're no longer a utility infielder. We need you to bring something special and unique. And Steve said it should be political communication ethics. He teaches journalism ethics. I think it should be part of our curriculum. And at this point in the interview process, I was very much in the consultant hustling for the client mode, which means you absolutely agree the client is absolutely right about everything they say. They're incredibly brilliant until they sign the contract, at which point they become just really daft and they need to pay more for your services. I said, Steve, that's a great idea. In part because it was a great idea, but in part because I was playing the role of consultant looking for the gig. I go give this big presentation, and I remember two questions from the presentation. One is from Frank. He asked, did the jokes ever change? No, Frank, the jokes never change. I've been working on this shtick for a long time. And the second was, what do you want to teach? And so again, I kicked into the consultant looking for the client mode. Steve Roberts had this great idea, and that should be teach political communication ethics. Again, in part because it was a terrific idea, but also in part because I was the consultant looking for the gig mode. And they, luckily enough, they invited me to join the faculty and said, political communication ethics. We look forward to your teaching in the spring. And I thought, great. So I did what any of you would do if you had to teach a new course. I went to Google and I Googled political communication ethics syllabus. If any of you had to teach Intro to Shakespeare starting next week, you'd Google the syllabus and you'd say a reading ahead of the students, and nothing came up. So, well, this is a bit of a challenge. So I go to Amazon, right? Because if Google doesn't know it, Amazon does. And I type political communication ethics. Two books came up. They were both edited by a guy named Professor Robert Denton at Virginia Tech University. The most recent was dated 2005. Thought, well, this is problematic. So I assembled the course. Half the class was sort of big think theory readings, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Orwell, and half was friends of mine, some of you who are with us today, who came in and talked off the record about what ethics looks like on a Tuesday if you're working on a presidential campaign or if you're a lobbyist or something like that. But I really still needed a book. I needed something that brought all these ideas together. So I reached out to Professor Denton, emailed him and said, your books are terrific. I'd like to do an updated ethics book, half the chapters from practitioners, half from academics, which models my class. Would you be willing to write a chapter? And I was really hoping he would say, that's great, I would love to edit that book, and then I could just sort of write the chapter and get on with it. And Professor Denton said no. He said, you know what, I'm retiring. No, I'm not going to edit the book, but if you put together a proposal, I edit a book series, and I would be happy to take a good look at that. And so I reached out to a bunch of people, many of you who are here, many of whom I'd never met before. I cold emailed academics around the country. I need someone to write about Machiavellian communication. So I Googled that, and luckily people came up. And then I emailed my friends, again, people who are with us today, and said, would you be willing to write this? And mercifully enough, people did. I sent the proposal off to Professor Denton. Roman Littlefield bought the book, and it officially comes out next week. And the book matches the class, which is half of big, think, thoughtful readings about the ancients, about Machiavelli, about digital ethics, about speech writing. And I was really pleased that I could involve my alma mater, Emerson College. Mark McPhail wrote, I think, a terrific chapter on the need or an ethical obligation to be brave in rhetoric. And Vincent Reynaud of Emerson College, and his co-author, Jennifer Lees-Marchand, who's not at Emerson, but wrote a terrific chapter on digital ethics. And I'm also really thrilled that a couple of my former students also wrote chapters. Andrew Lotz, who's a former Republican opposition researcher, wrote about opposition research. Rachel Wallace, who's a speechwriter, Democratic speechwriter, wrote a chapter on speechwriting. And Kip Wainscott, who's a very senior advisor to President Obama, wrote about the limits and ability of the law, and sort of where the law can be helpful and where it can't be so helpful. And it's, students can expect to see this next spring. Anthony had to put up with rough drafts of it by banging it around, testing the ideas. And the book itself is part of a larger project on ethics and political communication. Because it seemed like there just wasn't a thing, right? If you study journalism at GW or Emerson or anywhere else, you have to take ethics. If you study medicine, business, law, public relations, you have to take courses in ethics. There are books, there are journals, there's an infrastructure. There really isn't that for political communication, which is especially problematic as more schools like GW offer degrees in political communication. Schools offer minors, there are graduate degrees, there are certificates, there are classes in advocacy and digital advocacy and speech writing and ad making. But there really isn't a real sort of body of material for ethics. And so we started the project to promote the practice, teaching, and study of political communication ethics. That was a year and a half ago. We kicked it off with some of you. In the past year and a half, we've had a pretty good run. We held in-person events back when we were allowed to, leave our houses. Back in March, I think 100th maybe, we did that. We've done online chats like this one. We did one last week on digital ethics. We've done them on the ethics of campaign during a pandemic. We've done just typed chats, sort of a Google chat version, with on one hand, Sarah Isger, who is the communications director for then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And she was partnered with Mo Elliothy, who's now at Georgetown, but had been the communications director of the Democratic National Committee. Another one we did was with the head of the college Republicans and the college Democrats at George Washington University, who share an office. Back when you're allowed to go to offices, actually shared an office. We have another one we did, I just saw Jevin Hodge just joined us. We did a conversation about the ethics of running for office with a philosopher at GW and a candidate for the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, Jevin, who just joined us, about the ethics of running a campaign in a really tough competitive race in a really tough competitive year. We have a 5-question series in which we ask political practitioners, students, professors, and others the same 5 questions about ethics. We've written for The Hill, Campaigns and Elections, which is a publication for people who do campaigns and elections, predictably enough. We wrote one for the National Communications Association and for other outlets. Done a lot of podcasts, a lot of radio shows, been on television domestically and internationally. And I've given talks at everywhere from Oregon and Oregon State to Yale, to professional conferences. On a consulting firm even asked me to come in and talk about it. Elisa Massimino, who's with us this afternoon or this evening, and I talked to an international foundation about the ethics of their advocacy. And we intend to ramp that up, and the book is only the latest part of that. And it's really exciting to be a part of this with all of you. There are a couple of specific thanks I have to give. I hope you'll indulge me at the end of this rant. The first is obviously to Frank and my colleagues in the School of Media and Public Affairs, who've been remarkably supportive and endlessly patient in many ways with me. To the students in the School of Media and Public Affairs who've taken my ethics class and my other classes over the year, who've sat through rants and rough drafts and have kind of been the testing lab for all of these sorts of ideas. I've been beta testing this book for a couple of years on a lot of folks. All of you who are here who wrote chapters of the book, many of whom I've never actually met. This may be the first time I'm seeing many of your faces. Thank you very much for indulging me. Thanks also to those who wrote chapters as practitioners. Thanks to a couple of specific SMPA students, in addition to Anthony, who's sitting patiently waiting. Connor Kilgore, who's a rising senior who is critical in putting together the book. He's also an elected state official, party official, Republican Party official in New Hampshire. Two rising juniors, Jason Rucker and Zachary Nosenchuk, who have been working with me over the summer and helping do events and promotion. So it's really been a massive team effort. The last huge thanks, of course, has to go to my lovely young wife, Zoe, who is probably on here somewhere in a different room in the house. It's just kind of another weird Zoom thing. Every couple of years, I seem to come up with a new harebrained scheme that she patiently nods and smiles at the very last minute, says, no, don't do that. But usually when it's a marginally good idea, she says yes. And you know, I could not have done this or anything else I've done without her. So thank you, Zoe, for all that you do and all that you continue to do with my harebrained schemes over the years. So that's the big rant. That's the big thank you. Now, hopefully we can get on to the meat of the conversation.
We will do that. Peter, before I do, though, get into the meat of the conversation, I'm not going to take you there yet, but we will find out before the evening is out whether you believe that we can have ethical political communication. But I'd like to poll the group here for all of you who've got the gallery view on, and you can see 24, 25 of your closest friends, Zoom friends. And we have 3 screens, so I will check this out. Raise your hand if you think there is a crisis, an ethical crisis in the way we communicate politically in our crisis. So not everybody, most, pretty much. Okay, now let's measure the crisis on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is, it's a little annoying, it's a little crisis. 5 is liars, they're all their pants are on fire. How many of you think it's at a 1? You know, it's kind of bad, but it's not the end of the world. Not so many hands. 2, 3. All right, a few hands at 3. 4, it's getting up there. 5, as bad as it can get. Okay, so you've got our attention here. We obviously have a group that is tuned in and thinks this is bad. I don't know. Peter, where are you on the 1 to 5 scale?
I'm probably at a 3 or a 4 because, you know, political rhetoric in this country has always been kind of a hot mess. So it's all about where you set the bar. And I think the bar is pretty low for quality political discourse in America.
Anthony, you want to be in politics. You've been studying this as a student of Peter's. Where do you think it is on a 1 to 5 scale?
I would also agree with 4, maybe 5 sometimes. Like Peter said, it's always kind of been a mess. I mean, like, presidents have been saying terrible things about other candidates for like the longest time. So Trump the way he talks about other people is not necessarily new, but it's kind of a degradation from what our standard was, like maybe even.
I think that's, yes, safe. Anthony, the final paper, you had the fortune of being Peter Loge's student. And as I understand it, the final paper for your class was to explain your own ethical foundation for political communication. So what did you have to say in that paper?
It's been a while since I thought about that paper, but so if I remember correctly, what I said is that my ethical standard, well, there was a lot like going into it, but the basic gist of my argument was that my ethical standard was going to be something that kind of, I think that everyone who's going into political communications should have the ability to kind of be convicted in their own viewpoints, but not necessarily be, not open to change, if that makes sense. I think that it is completely right for people to it's completely right for people to set themselves up as being, correct, and this is like the correct course of action. We think we should support this cause because da-da-da-da-da, and then fight for that as hard as they can. But they should also be willing to change their views if new information comes. And specifically how that relates to ethics is because I feel that a lot of the problems that come about in our politics today are related to partisanship and people, not really willing to listen to the other side. They will they'll do really whatever it takes to win regardless of the actual costs. And I think that as I, grow into my career, I'm going to try to uphold the ethical standard that I set out in that paper, try to be the best version of myself that I can.
And your ethical standard in that paper is what? You want to be persuasive, obviously. You want to convince people, obviously. Will you lie?
No. So
will you leave out certain facts that get in the way of your argument?
What do you mean by that? Because
will you select the facts that you use to persuade people in a way that benefits your position, which might mean leaving unmentioned some facts that get in the way? So
if I have a holistic, or like as holistic as any human can come to a view of, an issue, right? And I'm making an argument trying to persuade people to agree with me. If I believe that, that what I'm doing is right, then I'm not necessarily going to constantly be bringing up arguments that might refute my case. I already think that my case is right, so I hope that makes sense. Like, I'm not going to lie, and I'm not going to purposefully omit information that I think would lead people closer to the truth, but I'm not going to include information that would lead people away from what I think is right.
So Professor Loge, obviously you've done your job here, because Anthony is really having to weigh what would be ethical and what would not, and how much you would include. In the book, Peter, you ask every author to do this, kind of go through this very same exercise, to address what ethical obligation political communicators have and to whom, and what kind of range of responses. What do they say?
It's a wide range, and a critical part of the question, and it's a question on the table for the project in ethics and political communication, is what ethical obligation do communicators have, if any, and to whom or what do they have it? You go from a conversation about Machiavelli, for example, and Machiavelli was into a politics that worked, right? He didn't trust anybody, and to the extent that everybody's going to be corrupt, you want to have power in the masses so they at least overthrow the nobles who are going to continue to be corrupt. And for Machiavelli, rhetoric wasn't noble at all. But if you look at the ancients, and there are two terrific chapters on the ancients in the book, part of rhetoric was an ethical ideal, right? Rhetoric was part of ethics and the service of ethics, something that we see reflected in Richard Weaver, who's a conservative public intellectual in the US in the 1950s and 1960s. But you kind of go from this ideal of rhetoric as an ethical act down to rhetoric as this functional thing we use to sort of figure out how to manage and govern ourselves.
And who does that? Who makes the decision as to who sets that bar, Peter? Is that some kind of consensus thing, or is there an ethics czar that says, here's where the line is, right? Because, and I'm hearing Anthony, I think we all are, and we're applying the real world around us, where we've got this kind of hothouse of politics right now, where it seems like anything goes. And it's driven by this massive amount of disinformation, very deliberate disinformation that's coming in, again, to try to move people, to confuse them or distract them, or persuade them to come down on a certain side of an issue. So who sets the bar?
If I were Plato, I'd say it would be the philosopher king, and coincidentally, I was one of those philosopher kings.
We nominate. Yes.
No, I'm completely in the tank for Protagoras, which is a phrase I think probably 6 of you got. That's a very good question. I think it's a bit of it's not really a moving target so much as it is eternally subjective. But the fact that it's subjective doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? There's a temptation to say, well, there can't be one person who decides, therefore everything goes. And I think that is equally mistaken. From my perspective, I think that people who engage in political communications obviously have to think about the next thing, right? The next election, not just elections. Most of politics, most of the time, isn't candidates running for office. It's NRA, Sierra Club, getting people to recycle, that kind of stuff. And then I think, and I've done this, right? I ran a consulting firm. I was a lobbyist. I really understand up close and personal the pressures of client demands and having to pay the rent. That said, I think what's critical for a communicator to remember is why they're bothering to do this, right? The election isn't about the win. The election is getting somebody you believe in office who can advance a set of values you believe and then continue the democratic process in which we get to continue to have these conversations, right? So it's not an end state. Democracy, the late John Lewis wrote in his posthumous op-ed that democracy is an act. It's not a state, right? At no point do people win democracy. Instead, we have an ethical obligation, I think, to keep that conversation going. And then within that, what counts as truth? What do you leave in? What do you leave out? You heard Anthony struggling with it, which is all I ask out of students, right? My standard line is that if I taught at Georgetown, we'd debate all semester, and in the end, the Jesuits would win. But I teach at GW, not Georgetown, so we're going to have to sort of figure it out as we go. So I think that is a critical piece of it. Like, have something more in the back of your head that matters more than the current client engagement, the next piece of legislation, or the next election.
Anthony, let me pose this question to you as someone who's already in the political realm, working in DC politics as you are, thinking about making a career out of this. And actually, it's not inconsequential here that you're in theater and satire, because you appreciate the power, right, of story, of narrative, the power of persuasion. Let's say you're running, or your candidate is running against an opponent who you think is really not only unethical, but completely unqualified, or whose positions you believe threatens democracy itself. How far and how low would you go to defeat someone whom you think is not merely a political opponent, but a threat?
It's a good question. It was part of the paper and also our midterm, I think. It was posed. So
would we call that a coincidence, Anthony?
Yeah, just a lucky coincidence. But it is interesting. I would say, I guess, like the same thing I said in my papers, which is that you need, basically my standard is weighing everything in terms of kind of how Peter was talking about. Your job is to get someone into office who is going to keep, the cycle going so that we can continue to have these conversations. I think for someone who is legitimately, absolutely a threat, I can't say that I wouldn't go pretty low to stop them from getting into office. Like, if I think that the next person to be elected is going to be like a fascist dictator, then yeah, I think I'd do a lot to stop them from getting into office. But with that said, that you also have to be careful about, the subjectivity of that statement, because, I can think this person is absolutely a threat to democracy, but in reality, they're just, a politician that I really don't like.
So Peter, are these ethics situational?
That's a tricky and loaded term. Absent an absolute ethical standard, one really does have to be able to step back and say, are they a threat to democracy? Or, as Anthony pointed out, somebody I just don't like. And all of us who do this think we do it for the right reasons, right? We all think we're the good guys. Very rarely have I run across somebody who said, I had a vision of the just and the right and the true. And I thought, to the heck with that, I'm gonna see what happens if I just be a jerk for a while. We all think we're being right and just and true. I think what we all have to do as advocates, though, is consider where exactly is that line. And I know that when you came and spoke to my class, you've talked about this, is what's the line you will not cross? Have that line going in your head, right? One of the things I ask my students to do, and I've asked others to do, is you take the 3, 4, or 5 lines you will not cross, why you do this, what are your absolutes, and put them on a Post-it note, or tape them to your bathroom mirror, or put them in your wallet, or somehow have this constant reminder of why you got into this, and then make sure you're sticking with those values. One of my great frustrations as a chief of staff in the House was that we always seemed to be one election away from governing. It was always, well, this isn't quite right, but it's right enough, and we've just got to get the majority back. Now we've just got to get the White House back. Now we've got to build up the majority. We've got to take the Senate. You're always sort of one set of talking points away from fulfilling your values. And I understand that. Like, I've run those campaigns. But at some point, you have to be able to step forward and say, you know what, these are my values, and now I'm fighting for them, or these violate my values, and I have to step away.
I want to ask another question of the group, another show of hands, please. How many of you have Facebook accounts? Raise your hand if you have a Facebook account. Raise your hand if you have a Twitter account. How many of you actively tweet? A good number. How about Instagram? Who's active on Instagram? All right. Snapchat. How many of you have been on one of these platforms and seen what you have considered to be hate speech or something that would qualify as disinformation or unethical speech in politics? Okay, I'm seeing almost unanimity there, Peter. Plato and Socrates didn't have Snapchat, okay? Ronald Reagan didn't, nor FDR, who had the radio, and Reagan had television, and Obama did the first Google town hall. We see how this has changed. But the social media environment we live in, you know, it would not be beyond somebody to say, Peter, this is a lovely thing you're doing, talking about political ethics or ethics in political communication. But given the world, the social media world we're in, it's hopeless. What would you say to that?
I would empathize on one hand. We've got a couple of book chapter authors with us who might agree with at least part of that sentiment. Professor Rideau, Professor Louise Marchand, Cheryl Conti, and Roz Lemieux wrote about on one hand the academic side, and the other hand the applied side. I work in politics. I spent a career in politics, so I am sort of definitionally an optimist. I have to believe things are going to be able to get better. I would also note that, you know, yeah, Instagram and Twitter and all that are new. Two anecdotes to help drive how far we've come, how quickly, but then also how much has stayed the same. The first is I was recently going through some stuff in my basement because I can't go anywhere else. And I came across an article from I think it was a Phoenix newspaper back in my first job for a member of Congress, then Congressman Sam Coppersmith of Arizona. And he was one of a handful of members of the House in 1994, I think, to have email. And the article noted that between January 1st and the middle of April, when the article was written, he had received 104 email messages. Some of you will get that many before this event is over. The other is I did the first AOL town hall chat with Senator Kennedy back when that was a thing, right? And then it was like we've been moving, and that was in 96 or something. So we've come really far, really fast. But that said, George Orwell, who among other things collected pamphlets and wrote about pamphleteers, described the pamphlet in pre-revolutionary America the way we would describe social media today. They can take any form. They could be scurrilous. They could be funny. They could be serious. They could be well documented. They just have to be short, basically. And so this means of pushing it out hasn't changed, right? The instinct hasn't changed. The speed has changed, the way we can manipulate it, the targeting, the data. Again, the authors of the book go into this in much more nuanced and interesting ways than I possibly could. But the idea that people make stuff up and try to be clever isn't new, right? Plato complained about this with Protagoras. Quintilian argued about, in his words, hack advocates, right? So a lot of it's just the same, only much faster and much more efficient.
There are a couple more questions back to Anthony, and then I'd like to open the questions to the group, and we'll do this in a couple of different ways. If you want to put a chat question in, you can do that anytime now, and I'll get that passed along. Or when we come there, you can raise your hand like this, and we'll just go to you, and please ask a question, as we say, on camera. Peter, what about this? What about the difference between ethics and civility? Is there a distinction?
You know, I think that's an important distinction for me. We should all be more civil. Please use your inside voice more. Everybody's tired of everybody trying to govern in all caps. That said, sometimes incivility is uncalled for. Sometimes, and not everybody has earned your respect. Sometimes you have to take that step. And I think two examples come to mind. One you see a lot, and that's Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Shutting down Birmingham was not a polite thing to do. But as Dr. King pointed out, they had a deal, they worked in good faith, they were betrayed, so they had to take this other action. And he rooted his argument in Testament and America's founding documents. So I think it's fundamentally ethical, although it's certainly criticized for being incivil. More recently, AOC and Mr. Yoho. On one hand, his comments were incivil, just rude. But Representative Alexander Acosta-Cortez, AOC is just much easier to say, pointed out that it was beyond rude, but also violated, but it was denigrating to women, and it was much deeper than just a sort of snarky remark, in passing, right? And so I think Mr. Yoho was both incivil and unethical. The response, I think, was profoundly ethical because it, again, made an argument rooted in something deeper than just the moment. So please be more civil. But please also, when you have to, be incivil, but as you are incivil, please do so. I think we have to do so ethically.
I mean, how to get civility back into our discourse is a big question and a big challenge. And that's something that even, in my career, I've seen deteriorate very, very sharply in Washington across our politics. And it really, where I started noticing it in Washington, big way, actually was after 1994, when the Newt Gingrich revolution took place and the Contract for America, a lot of the Republicans came to town. A lot of them were young, sort of young guns, and they broke a lot of the sort of Robert's Rules of Order kind of conventions. Now that has been obviously echoed and amplified through media, and left, right, and everybody in between. Peter, you write your own chapter in the book about what you call a civil religion. What is civil religion, and can this save us?
Yeah, one of the great joys of one of the privileges or bennies of editing a book is you get to write whatever chapter you want. And logically, I would write the practitioner chapter because that's what I did for so long, but actually one of the academic chapters. And it was on this notion of a humble American civil religion. And a civil religion is a coherent putting together of sort of who we are, where we came from, and a set of sort of core American values. It was popularized by Robert Bellah. It's been written about more recently by, again, Philip Gorski in a book called American Covenant. It's been written by John Carlson at Arizona State University, who's written about this. And it's this notion that America is an idea and an ideal, right? We have our founding documents, we have our sacred spaces, we have our sacred places and our sacred holidays, just as any faith does. And we've let it down, right? I mean, America has never lived up to those founding ideals. The guy who wrote All Men Are Created Equal owned slaves. But the set of ideals and the promise of meeting those ideals is baked into those documents. And I think we owe a fealty to that, right? We need to work towards the idea and the ideal of an American democracy. Richard Rorty in Achieving Our Country wrote that you have to be loyal, not to the country you live in, not in the country you wake up to every morning, but to your dream country, right? And I think that's what we need to do as a country, and talk about how it is that we can move towards a more perfect union, right? Rather than saying, aha, we've achieved it, check the box, we can go do whatever we want. That would be a sort of bad nationalistic version. And I also don't think we can surrender. I don't think we can say the project is done. I don't think we're too flawed to fix. I agree with President Clinton's line that there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. That said, it requires, and Anthony and I go back and forth on this, we've gone back and forth over email a fair amount this summer about it. It requires an honest reckoning, an honesty about the sins of America, about what we've done wrong. But then how together we can live up to its promise, if not its reality, always recognizing that the promise can never fully be fulfilled.
So Anthony, let me invite you in on that. What is your take? And when you and your professor go back and forth on this, here's your opportunity. Have at it. You got an audience.
I guess I agree for the most part with Professor Loge on like the idea of civil religion. But my main problem is that the honest reckoning that he talks about is almost never actually honest. I think that the United States as a country has its ideals in the right place, but I think that oftentimes when in practice, the civil religion put into practice, it either turns into nationalism or it's kind of like these half-baked promises. I think a good example of that, you could see, like Professor Loge and I talked about this, like Abraham Lincoln, for example, he kind of uses the same rhetoric of like, it's a broken country, but we can do all these things to fix it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, but it wasn't really out of like the goodness of his heart. It was because he wanted to win the Civil War. You know, I mean, you get presidents like President Obama. I like President Obama. There are some things I disagree with that he did, but for the most part, I liked him as president. Still, he was a black man in America, and throughout his whole time in office, he barely did anything to actually support Black Lives Matter or do any real criminal justice reform. And I mean, you can say, you know, Republicans fought him on stuff like that, but there was still ways he could have used his position of power to support that. And the way this relates to civil religion is that I feel that people like Barack Obama, who espouse this, you know, they kind of this rhetoric of like the United States and its ideals and, you know, we're a broken country, but we can be better. They often don't actually focus on the glaringly terrible side of this country. And it's because civil religion has to be hopeful. Like it has to be, the rhetoric has to be hopeful, and it has to kind of fit into people's preconceived notions about the United States. So when people actually want to bring up, you know, serious issues like wealth inequality or like police brutality and things like that, they end up often being kind of like shoved out of politics because they don't agree with, they're not being hopeful. They're trying to have an honest take, like the honesty that Professor Loge talks about, and it doesn't work. No one agrees with it. And I think that's the main problem, is that I don't know really how to solve that, but until that's solved, I don't think that this idea of like civil religion can actually be effective.
It's interesting, Anthony, listening to you, two thoughts occur. One is, if you're going to have a civil religion, you need to probably read the Bible. So the Bible is the Constitution. The Bible is our civics. And we know that we've got a gigantic crisis in civics. People don't even understand how our government works or how it's supposed to work. And the other thing is, you got to be able to have a safe space or some kind of space where you can have this conversation and have this reckoning. And with a lot of the politics and a lot of the other things that we've got out there, that space has been squeezed out. And whether it's a conversation about race or gun violence or whatever, it's very difficult to convene that conversation. I'd like to broaden the conversation now and invite some of you in. And I might do something really kind of mean here, because I was looking on the screen to see, okay, who do I know and who can I call on without any warning to ask the first question or make the first observation? And my friend Scott Widmeyer, who happens to be the chair of the School of Media and Public Affairs National Council, who's been in public discourse and public affairs and public relations and politics all of his professional life. Scott, I'd be very interested for you to share with the group what you think about ethics in political communication, because you've been a professional political communicator. You have a business called Widmeyer Communications. That's what you do. And what you think about this idea of a civil religion, and you know, turn a question back to Peter or Anthony if you'd like. And then Peter, I would also like to invite you to invite any of your chapter authors to participate in this conversation, because it'd be very interesting to hear from some of them. But Scott, why don't you start?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Frank. I've really enjoyed. Are you getting an echo?
Nope. No, you sound
okay,
great.
All right. Okay. I've really enjoyed. Hold on a second. I've got to disconnect something here. Hold on.
Okay.
The echo was on my end. Now we're okay. Is that okay?
Yep. You sound great.
Well, one, big thanks to GW and SMPA for putting this event together for Peter tonight. Peter is such a knowledgeable source and resource on all things about ethics. So the conversation has been really enlightening, and I've really enjoyed hearing from Anthony as well. It's a fresh perspective that we really need to hear more of. So thank you, Anthony, for enlightening us as well. I so one of the questions you asked me, Frank, was, what advice I have and how do I carry out the work that I do in communications. I mean, the first thing that I believe in is that you really have to put the facts out there, and you've got to be truthful about what you're putting out there. I know the question was put to Anthony in terms of how much facts do you put out there if you're waging a political campaign and you have opposition on the other side. I kind of side with how Anthony presented his take on that, and you put as much facts out there as you need. You just certainly want to make sure you're not hurting your case. The key thing is you have to tell the truth. You've got to be ethical about it, and if you're not, the truth will come out eventually. The truth always comes out eventually, and we're all seeing so many unfold in recent months, whether it's with the Republicans or dealing with Democrats or dealing with issues, Black Lives Matter. The truth is eventually going to come out, and that's what we have to stand for. We got to stand for the truth. I would ask this question also. We're talking tonight about ethics in political communication. I'd like to put some questions on the table, and Frank, you resonate with this as well. I would like to talk about some ethics. What can we do about ethics in political news reporting? Because there's a big void there, and we see it play out every day in terms of the people who are covering the White House, and we see it on both sides. This is not a Republican thing. This is not a Republican media thing or a Democratic media thing. So I would put that question out for consideration tonight as well.
Sure, just to make things really easy. We're afflicted right now in our culture, and not just here. Some of it is because of technology. Some of it is because of our politics and our polarization. Peter, I don't know how you feel about this, but I mean, I think that and it's why Steve Roberts teaches ethics in journalism. I mean, that right. It is a very challenging thing and a very important thing. And how we're covering politics right now. It's all about horse race. It's all about the latest tweet and who makes the most noise. And it's a barrage of attack and opinion too much of the time, and not enough listening to people beyond the beltway and outside of our bubbles. It's not even remotely representative of the diversity of experience and background in this country. But Peter, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question, Scott. I'm glad you asked it. One of the reasons I think it's an important question is because I don't see them as completely disconnected, right? I know that for journalists, it's easy to say, no, we just do our thing. It's you political hacks. You try to sell us whatever, and it's the dance. That's what I learned at Emerson College. A political consultant or a candidate pushes as hard as they can until the reporter says enough. The reporter pulls as hard as they can until the candidate or spokesperson says, no, I'm not going to talk to you about that. I think the relationship is much more complicated. I think the press is complicit, and not just in editorialing, not just in the editorial side, but on the broadcast side. Let me give you a really specific example that's front of mind. So yesterday, I did an interview with a national television service, doesn't matter which one, but it owns a bunch of stations around the country. And they asked me about the Democratic convention. It was Hearst. So they asked me about the convention in Milwaukee for a hit on the Milwaukee station, but then a broader question was really about Kanye West. And the story clearly wanted to be hey, is it this kind of nutty? And do you think it's going to matter? And he's going to pull votes. And my answer to the reporter was, this raises two really interesting ethical questions. One is, Kanye's campaign seems to be funded or advised largely by Trump staff. The person who dropped off his ballots, for example, the other day is on Trump's payroll. So it appears to be potentially Trump staff or Trump supporters are trying to support someone who they think can pull votes from Vice President Biden. I like sharp elbow politics. I learned politics in Boston. Is that okay? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting ethical question. But I also noted that it was really weird to me that the press was covering this. There are hundreds of people who file to run for president every year, many of whom have very strong, well thought out opinions on things. No one has asked Mr. West's opinion on cap and trade, on climate change, on any range of other issues. Instead, it's played as a celebrity play, which I think does a disservice to the voters, and I think it does a disservice to the democratic process.
Yeah,
We'll see if my interview airs. Having criticized the reporter. I don't know, Frank. Does that usually work?
No, I mean, this is a perennial problem, right? The media's preoccupation with personality, with celebrity, with controversy. You want to go out there and do something about cap and trade. How about doing a story about the national debt? We've added to that a lot. How about doing a story about the connection between employment and healthcare, and the millions of people in this country who have lost both because of this strange system that we've got? I see Professor Mark McPhail there. Can you wave to everybody, sir? Say hi, and you'll pop up on. Okay. I want to ask you about the chapter that you wrote in this book. You wrote about the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Project for a case study in ethical political communication.
I did.
You wrote about moral courage in the service of democratic engagement and politics. Moral courage in the service of democratic engagement and politics. Why don't you, Professor, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad you contributed a chapter. I'm so glad you contributed a chapter to Peter's book. But let me invite you to talk a little bit about your 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project and the points that you're making in your chapter.
Okay. Well, it actually talks mostly about Dick Malpass, who was Secretary of State in Mississippi, apologized to the families of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, and then went on to head the Philadelphia Coalition, which brought Edgar Ray Killen to what amounted to the best justice we were going to get. I started by looking at the same thing that Peter did. I looked for the work on political ethical communication. What I found basically was that the consensus was that political ethical communication is whatever you decide to do. And if you are trying to define a practice and you're looking for concrete examples of that practice, I thought that Malpass expressed that quite concretely. So that he had a set of values, he lived those values, and the outcomes that he pursued were in alignment with those values. And he spoke with the rhetoric that he drew upon was coherent rhetoric. That is, it matched the words with the deeds. And if you use that as a standard, then you end up writing a very short book on political ethical communication because it's very rare. No, I mean, in all honesty, I mean, we're seeing the most extreme manifestations of this now, and the way it's being managed. I mean, I think I've seen 2 or 3 reporters, to get back to the issue that was raised earlier about political reporting, who have actually engaged this rhetorical strategy, which I suspect is being taught to these people, which is don't answer the question. And this is just, it's amazing to watch this again and again and again and again and again with all of the representatives of this administration. And it happens consistently. They'll be asked a question and they won't even talk around the question. They'll take a totally different perspective that has nothing to do with the question that they're being asked. And I think the only person I've seen who's really kind of nailed this was Anderson Cooper. And this was a while back where he just went right at it. I mean, we are looking at pathological lying to the world right in front of us. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, liberal, conservative, the man lies pathologically and does it essentially with impunity. Because nobody says, well, a couple of people have said, President Trump, you're lying. And then the question becomes, does he know he's lying? Or does he really believe what he's saying is true? And I mean, this is a country that was essentially built on lies. If you look at the history, I'm actually writing a book on the history of diversity at Indiana University right now. And I'm contextualizing that by looking at the history of interactions with First Nations people. Treaty after treaty after treaty after treaty broken. Lies,
made and broken with no intention, actually, ever.
So they knew they were lying when they did it. And I mean, once you bring it to that level, it's really difficult. Earlier, when Peter was talking about civil religion and kept saying we, I was like, what we are you talking about, brother? Because I'm not a part of that we. And as a rhetorician and somebody who studied rhetoric and also studied it within the context of race, I think there are some real serious questions about our beliefs and assumptions about rhetoric in and of itself as persuasion, in terms of, one, whether or not you ever persuade anyone of anything. So our whole epistemology, and it was interesting to hear you talk about Protagoras, because if you go back to that dialogue, that's the dialogue where Socrates basically establishes, one, epistemology as a study of justified true belief, but also that's the dialogue where Socrates advances the notion that people do wrong out of ignorance, and that we are supposed to ignore the evidence of our senses when we see people do wrong, because it's human nature to be rational. It's not rational to do harm to yourself. And since you wouldn't do harm to yourself, why would you do it to someone else? Well, that third piece doesn't follow from the first two. And in fact, the denial of the evidence of our senses is one of the defining characteristics of American identity. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
I think there are a couple of parts that I think that, I mean, it's just Mark and I have known each other for a long time. He was a couple of years ahead of me at Emerson and kind of a legend when I was on campus at Emerson College.
I was a legend.
You and your brother, you and your late brother Roger were legendary. I was on the debate team. You guys, anyway, the Protagoras points out though that we can't know, right? The Socratic position is there is this knowable truth out there to which we can aspire, and bad language leads us away from it. Protagoras, it's a device. I mean, remember the dialogues are literary. Right. So in that dialogue, they're debating about this other thing. The broader point is Protagoras says we can teach the art of politics, which is people to speak and act on behalf of the state. It's in a couple of chapters in the book.
Socrates says that Protagoras says.
Right. That is true. But in Protagoras,
if you go back to what we have, the fragments that we have. So right. The Ancillary to the Pre-Socratics, Freeman's work. If you go back to those fragments, there are a number of those fragments that directly challenge the claims that are made in the dialogues. And really, I think that the best book on Plato and Socrates is I.F. Stone's work, Trial of Socrates.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to pull us from ancient Greece back to present day for just a moment,
okay?
Because I think very interesting, and it's actually very relevant, the connections from the classics and the ancients to today. But I do want to open this up to anybody else who's got a question or a comment. So let me just pause, and if you do, please wave, because I'm going to see somebody waving, and then I will. Anahi, I see Anahi. So Anahi, let you jump in, and it's very good to see you. And go ahead and have at it.
Hi. So as someone who is currently it is my job to be doing social media for a congresswoman. We answer every single email. We answer every single call and everything. We ignore social media. Why? And we kind of treat Congress people the same, or maybe President Trump, some of his tweets we ignore versus what he says. Why do we treat social media? Why is it the exception to ethics, kind of in terms of responding to our constituents versus, responding to every call, responding to every letter? Is it just because it's new? Is it because of the context of what it is?
Okay, Anahi, thank you very much. Peter, you want to take that?
I think it's good to see you. I think that might actually it's interesting that you posit it as an ethical question rather than just one of time, or whether you want to chase that rabbit hole. One of the things we know about social media is there are bots and people can set up different accounts and that you just have no idea who's talking to whom. And it's easy to just sort of get into these little snipping fights with, who knows who or what you're arguing with, versus email where theoretically you can touch it to a specific person. Not every office responds to every email, right? Some insist on a name and address and they only respond to constituents in their district or their state. Just because, as you know, up close and personal, staff time is precious and you simply run out of time, right? Your most precious commodities as a decision maker are time and attention. And if you're spending all of your time and attention responding to people on Twitter, you're not spending your time and attention briefing the boss on water quality or crime or debt or climate or any of those sorts of things. But that does raise interesting questions then, ethical questions then for those pushing out these messages, right? If you're an advocate or an advocacy organization, is it okay to sort of flood the airwaves with fake accounts or even real accounts, just getting people to push as much gunk out there as you can? Where this plays out specifically in federal policymaking is not as much in Congress as in the rulemaking process, right? Where federal rules go out for notice and public comment, NOPRs, and they invite public comment. And some advocacy organizations use social media, digital media, and email to just throw as much stuff, like cut and pasted canned stuff, into the system as possible, which somebody has to sort through and deal with, which takes time away from looking at the real arguments, and people aren't making real arguments, right? And you're not old enough to remember, but back in the day, it was postcard campaigns. Get everybody you know to sign a postcard, and we're going to drown the house in mail, right? So I think that is the other side of the ethical political advocacy social digital media question.
Peter, what could you maybe, I think there needs to be some explanation. What's a postcard?
It's like a record.
Yeah, right. Anahi, does that answer your question? Does that address what you were getting to?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Who else would like to jump in? Okay, I see Matthew Howland. Matthew, good to see you. And Carol, I'll come to you next.
Thank you. Great conversation so far. With the idea of ethics in political communication, I can't help but feel like it takes both sides. And if one side is being ethical and the other is not, and the ethical side loses, what is gained? And I recall something that I learned in Professor Heineman's media effects and persuasion class, where there was a study that was done where when campaigns lie, it achieves the desired effect. When the voter is told that it's not true, they admit that it's not true, but they keep their position that the lie achieved anyways. So I can't help but feel like the reality is what can be gained. This is not an argument against ethics, but what can be gained in ethical political communication if the ethical side continues to lose? It's almost like you need both sides to come to an agreement in the participation of the ethical communication.
I think this is something that Anthony, you wrestled with a lot. I mean, it's in your final paper. You talked about this in class a lot. You and I have talked about it. What do you as a current SMPA student speaking to an SMPA alum, what do you think?
I definitely agree. It requires the participation of both parties to really, both sides have to be ethical for it to work in the ideal scenario. Part of my paper was actually talking about this, and I think that you have to, at least personally, I grapple with the issue like this. If both sides are ethical, it is good. If one side is not ethical, obviously they're gonna win, and then the other side kind of it becomes rough. But like if you decide to then abandon ethics, like go all the way in the opposite direction, be like the other side is being unethical, we're not gonna be ethical either, then that just creates an even worse system in the long run. So it is kind of a depressing thought, but the only option you really have is to try to behave as ethically as possible and try to make the standard of behavior like ethical. Because if you don't, then both sides are just going to continue to be more and more unethical, and like you're going to get candidates who are just completely lying on both sides, and then it doesn't really help anyone. The same way as as one side being unethical doesn't help. So I guess as an answer to the question, like yes, you're right, but there's no, in my opinion, and Peter might have a different opinion about this, there's no real solution other than to just try.
It's so interesting. Back to Scott's question about journalism, right? Having done a lot of it, having covered a lot of campaigns, I can think of in every single campaign, somebody's lobbed some certainly incendiary, if not unethical, allegation at somebody else about their mental health or swift boats, or you can come up with all sorts of things. Then the candidate, the candidate on the receiving end has to decide, do I even acknowledge this? If so, am I just elevating it? Journalists then have to decide, do we cover this? Or if so, are we just elevating it? The challenge on the social media platforms now is, what do they allow and disallow? They've actually disallowed things that the President of the United States has said, all right? So it seems to me, whether it's two sides agreeing to something, or Peter, you're the ethics czar, there is a standard. And the question increasingly, it seems, comes back to who enforces that and at what peril. So there are all kinds of fact-checking sites now. All right, everybody's being fact-checked. If you call something out, your pants are on fire, or you've got 3 Pinocchios, or whatever it is. The consequence for that is people know that you've said something wrong or been misstating or whatever. But do you pay a price? You're not fined. Nobody levies a fine. Nobody says you're out of the race, right? So it's a very, very, very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing. This is not ancient Greece.
But even in ancient Greece, it wasn't that easy.
No, of course it wasn't easy, but there was, and this is pointed out in the book, which I applaud, I think in Ken Chase's chapter, about the very deliberate nature of citizenry, or at least the enfranchised citizenry, in deciding and being part of this in what you could argue is at least a more deliberate way than perhaps we do it now. I don't know.
I think it's part of that is a deliberateness. His chapter, I thought, unpacks it very well, and it also notes that Athens was like 250,000 people. There's structural. I mean, it's for a lot of reasons. I think and I like that. Like I would like to move towards that. Now, part of it, I think, I sympathize with all of this. Again, I don't come at this as an academic. I come at it as a practitioner who keeps trying to figure out the best thing to do. One thing I think I encourage my students to do, and I encourage others to do, is think about why you're doing this at all, right? I mean, I didn't get into politics to meet lobbyists or to eat cheese cubes, right? I got into politics, and also, I mean, those of you who work in politics know that if you want to get rich and famous, there are far easier ways to do it than, be a legislative assistant hanging out in the Longworth building. So remember that and behave that way. Behave as if it mattered because it does matter, right? And that's just kind of an internal, ethereal, that's just a thing you have to believe. You have to carry that with you. The other piece, pragmatically, as a couple of people have mentioned, is it used to be if you lie, you get caught, so don't get caught, right? So the reason you shouldn't lie is because you'll get caught lying and you're gonna lose your job, and certainly in Washington, if you're a lobbyist, you get to lie precisely once. After that, you become a barista because no one will take you seriously or talk to you again, right? But
I knew that were true.
If there are no more barista jobs, but people who are lobbyists know that all you have is your reputation, right? You can't. It's a small town, and people remember that stuff. It's the elected officials we see who make the headlines, right? But that's not most of us who work day to day in politics.
Yeah,
I think the other piece of this is, we have to, I'm stealing a line from somebody who brought it up to me in a meeting, that we can make the truth clickbait. It's not like only bad ideas are popular, right? It is hard to be smart and ethical and clever and effective. That's why they pay you, right? And you can make that commitment. Mayor Pete did this, and Pete Buttigieg did this in his campaign, his Rules of the Road, which is now part of the Biden campaign. Other campaigns have done this. They've made a personal commitment because this is the right thing to do. It's harder. It doesn't always work, but it can be done, and I think it's the right thing to do.
Carol, Richard, you have a question.
There's a practical aspect to all this, since we're in the School of Media and Public Affairs, is that it's harming the press. I talked to a political activist today who was telling me I don't read anything anymore because as soon as I hit the third paragraph, I know where this person is coming from, and it's slanted. Because it is opinion. Opinion has crept into everything, or maybe it's not opinion, but telling in the first paragraph that the president is telling a lie would not have been acceptable in a previous presidency. And it makes the daily paper feel tainted. So we, the journalists who are trying to write this stuff, are dealing every day with the fact that there's unethical stuff being flung back and forth by the people who we're trying to cover. And it's ending up making people not trust us.
But Carol, this is a very interesting point. And I've thought a lot about this because I have, as a former White House correspondent, I've asked myself, how would I cover the current occupant of the White House? Because I would not be able to cover the current occupant of the White House the way I covered previous occupants of the White House, because he's doing the job so differently. And he's using the bully pulpit in a different way, you know? So what is it that you think journalists should do in an environment that is as white hot radioactive as that we're in right now, where politicians are doing the kinds of things that they're doing on all sides of the issue, right? They're all trying to get heard on social media. They're trying to get their own clickbait.
Well, say you're talking about, oh, I don't know, Jimmy Carter. He says something dumb, perhaps, and you, the journalist, write the story saying he said it. And then you go and talk to some professor at Syracuse or George Washington, the professor who says, boy, that was a dumb thing he said. And the next day you have a story that says, president's comments derided by professionals, you know? Took 3 days for all of that to happen. Nowadays, the president says, whatever it is he says, you are obligated now, because it's untrue, to say that it's untrue, or to say that he has, for example, said something that was 180 degrees different from what his health professionals have been saying about the coronavirus. And then it all gets together, goes out in the same story, the comment by the president, and then the assertion that it's untrue by, frankly, the press, because they know what the other people have said in the past. So it goes very fast. There's no time for sort of sensible, responsible reporting after that, because the next day the president says something else that's outrageous, and boom, you do it again. And so truth just doesn't get caught up to what the reporting is doing, and we're guilty, really, of doing it, but it's better than not pointing out the untruths. If you just let it sit there, it is understood to be the case because the president of the United States said so. But a terrible ethical issue for us, the journalists who are trying to cover this. I covered the White House myself, and I would never have said in the lead paragraph that the president told an untruth, because probably he was wording it carefully enough that it wasn't an untruth, you know?
Or making a mistake, whatever. Well, so Peter, you know, if you were writing a formula, if you were a good academic here and you come up with a formula for all of this, the notion of ethics would, the formula for ethics would have something about velocity in it, right? The speed of all of this. Does that change this? Because as Carol is speaking, she's totally right. And the President of the United States can now get to more than 80 million people at 3 in the morning or whatever time he wants to. He doesn't need to go through any mediators any longer, right? The news organizations are having to respond and react in ways that they didn't have to do because information moved more slowly. People absorbed their information differently. What, in fact, does that velocity, and maybe Professor McPhail wants to weigh in on this too, how does velocity of information affect how it's used and the ethics around it, or does it?
I think, clearly the velocity changes how it's used, right? And we all move much faster. I volunteered on a mayor's race when I was a kid, and my job, because I was a kid, was to hand deliver press releases by bicycle, right? We don't do that anymore. So yeah, velocity changes the tactics. But I reflect on something one of our colleagues, Professor Pat Phelan, said in a faculty meeting when I was talking about this idea of the project on ethics. And initially it was going to be political communication ethics. And she pointed out that one has ethics that are applied to political communication. You don't have political communication ethics, then family ethics, then business ethics. You have ethics. There's a way one ought to behave. And we try in the moment to behave that way. And I don't know that, and I think we can behave more or less ethically in a moment, right? It's not like I do 4 good things and I'm now an ethical guy and I can do whatever I want, or 4 bad things and I'm unethical and I'm forever doomed. There's another piece of this, though, that you get at that Anthony and his classmates last spring and the spring before that, and I expect next spring, are going to talk about. And that is whether or not you have a greater ethical responsibility if more people listen to you. Mm-hmm. Right? Do you have a greater ethical responsibility than I do because you have more Twitter followers? And is my responsibility greater than Anthony's because I have more Twitter followers than him? And if so, where do you draw that line? And then who says? Right? Does your volume determine your ethical foundation? And I would suggest we all just sort of behave better aside from that, but I'm an optimist, right?
I'm glad to hear that. Well, part of being ethical is doing what you promised. And one of the things we've promised is to wrap this up around 7:45. But before we do, Anthony, I want to come back to you for a couple of kind of closing thoughts, because you're our future, right? You're the guy who's going to go out and do this. You're gonna, everybody's got their threshold. I think it'd be really interesting for all of us to hear how your study with Professor Loge and your thought about what constitutes ethical political communication will shape you in the work that you do. How will you incorporate this? What will you stand for or not stand for when you see it?
That's a great question. There's a lot to that. I think that it definitely has it's got me thinking a lot more about not only just like behaving more ethically in general and like making sure that I do that as I go into my career, but also just kind of the consequences, of my own actions and other people's actions on ethical discourse. And I think that it's definitely, studying with Professor Loge is definitely going to help me. I've established, I think, pretty solid foundation for who I want to be, what I want to do in this field. I mean, you said this when you were reading my bio. I want to support progressive candidates, but specifically, I know that I don't want to do that while also causing any detriment to the system. And as Professor Loge said, it is very possible to do things that are unethical by accident, or just like not everyone is perfectly ethical in practice. I know I'm not completely unrealistic about that, but I have now a standard that I'm going to practice, and I think that this class and this book in general is just good for that, because it helps you to kind of think about these things, because like the whole reason it exists is because you're not really taught these things otherwise. I mean, obviously you're supposed to be ethical in your day-to-day life. I think most people would think that they are being ethical, but having the multiple perspectives and reading through all of these chapters about like the ancient Greeks and the different people that wrote these chapters, some of them have opinions I don't really agree with, but I think at the end of the day, it is definitely shaped me for the better, and it has put me in a good place to start my career. Well,
that's encouraging. And, I really, we all wish you all the best. I said we were going to wrap up, but I do see Jason with his hand up, and I'll bend the rules for one last brief question, Jason, or comment, and a last brief answer from Peter or Anthony or anybody to whom this question is addressed, so we can let people get on their way. But Jason, go ahead.
Thanks, Frank, and I will keep it brief. Just something, Anthony, that you said just now I wanted to ask about. Going back to the ancient Greeks, to be ethical, is that just not breaking the rules? Is it not lying? Is that what it is to be ethical? Or sort of as the ancient Greeks or Plato, as they talk about, is it making better citizens? Educating them, increasing their virtue. And if so, is that even possible? I mean, heck, in Protagoras, Socrates notes that even the wisest political people can't change the opinions of others. So is that even possible? Is it not breaking the rules, or is it actually making better citizens?
I think that it can be, I think it can be both. I think you can strive. I think primarily being ethical is striving to make a more ethical future. And that is part of what I outlined in my paper as part of my standard, is I'm going to try and create a more ethical future. And a lot goes into that, a lot of weighing, a lot of thinking about the specific situation, which is why it's kind of hard for me to instantly define my standard. But I think that you should be behaving ethically because you want the future to be more ethical. So you are creating better citizens. And part of creating better citizens is behaving at a standard which does not, break the rules. You don't want to lie. You don't want to, because that's creating citizens who think that lying is okay. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. All right. I broke the rules for Jason. I'll break the rule for Jack because I see Jack waving his hand, and then we really will wrap. Go ahead, Jack.
Okay. I'm an 86-year-old ex-naval officer. I live in Shepherdstown, West Virginia.
Nice place.
And I'm looking for true north. My parents, I remember Lowell Thomas, and 15 minutes, all the news you could stand. And then Walter Cronkite was my true north. And I don't think we have a true north anymore to bounce off the ethical or civil discourse. And that's really scary to me.
Yeah, we don't have a Walter Cronkite anymore. There was a time when there were 3 networks, and those 3 networks every night at 6:30 convened most of America. But that was actually a fairly short time in America, in the history of America and American journalism. The number of voices we've got now is amazing, and there will be plenty of people, by the way, Jack, who would tell you that true north that you had was, was a bunch of white men making the decision about what the news was going to be, and maybe not as representative and as deep and nuanced as it needed to be. I'm really worried about it. When I went to work for CNN, it was in 1984, and it was the first not only cable network. There was no internet, and we were it when we were the only 24-hour news organization. I worked for the Associated Press before that. The Associated Press never put an opinion in a story. It was absolutely he said, she said, all that kind of thing. I wrote a memo to my correspondents when I was the bureau chief at CNN. This is true. And I said, please avoid 2 words when you do a live shot. I think. The audience actually doesn't care what you think. They don't care what your opinion is. They care what you see, what you hear, what you can report, what you can document. But those, I'm sorry to say, Jack, those days are gone. And they're gone because people they're ingesting news in real time. They're absorbing it off of their devices 24/7. They have so much choice, and they exercise that choice. There are still great, and I'll shut up with this because unfortunately you've invited me to get on my pedestal on this one, but there is great journalism out there, whether it's The Guardian or the Wall Street Journal, whether it's NPR or the BBC. There's fabulous journalism out there. Here's the difference. You are now your executive editor. You are now your executive producer. You have to go find it, find the stuff that you trust, that also challenges you, and that's where it gets tough with a broader public, and follow that, as opposed to having it fed to you reliably by Walter Cronkite, because Walter Cronkite is not coming back. Not going to happen. Peter, I'm going to let you say a few closing remarks, because this has been an amazing evening and you made it all possible.
Thank you, Frank. I would note that Anthony and Jason are classmates. And one of the reasons I love my job and I remain incredibly optimistic about America's political and social future is that it's going to be run by people like Anthony and Jason, who think deeply and thoughtfully about big, important issues, then go out and make stuff happen, which I think is pretty cool. I'm under no illusion that we're going to teach a class and fix America. But what I do want to have people do is think, I'm only going to do a news dump on a Friday. I got to keep the tweets short and with images, as Jason and Zachary keep reminding me. And is this the most ethical thing to do? And I know it works because I spoke at a professional conference for political consultants. And after my talk, someone came up to me and said, "You're not going to remember me. I was one of your students a long time ago. You talked about ethics. I keep that in mind. It's kept me out of jail and it's made me a better consultant." We can do this. The book is a small piece of it. Frank, your support, School of Media and Public Affairs, is a piece of it. It's a commitment of Emerson College where me and Mark both went, where Professor Renaud teaches. President Lee Pelton has a strong commitment to honest, ethical, civic, public engagement. We can make this a thing. And I think, frankly, we have to make this a thing. So thanks for indulging me. Thanks for the opportunity. And hopefully we can all get to work.
Okay, and let's all give Peter a round of applause for his book and his incredible work. Peter, thank you so much. Anthony, thank you so much. We wish you the best of luck, and I hope you run the world someday very soon. And good night, everybody, and be well, stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.